Thanks to Kimberly there. Now, an estimated 35,000 Syrians so far displaced by fighting in Aleppo are being held at the Turkish border, raising concerns about the conditions they're facing there. And tens of thousands more are expected to arrive at the border over the coming days if Russian and Syrian airstrikes continue. Well, Yvette Cooper is the chair of Labour's Refugee Task Force and was, of course, one of those in the running to become the party's leader last September. She's with me now, as you can see. And a very good morning to Ms Cooper. I mean, what should Britain's response be to this growing refugee and humanitarian crisis?
Well, you need a global response to what's happening, and you're right that what's happening with Aleppo is deeply worrying. 70,000 people reported to have fled Aleppo as a result of the bombardment by the Assad government, but also by Russian forces as well. And so the priority has to be to do anything possible to try and stabilise the situation in Syria, to get the peace talks back on track and put whatever pressure we can on Russia to stop this bombardment of civilian areas, which is increasing the number of refugees.
So you've no doubt then that the Russians are not just, as they say, attacking ISIS and the terrorists, that they are bombing civilian areas.
I think there's clear evidence that the majority of the Russian bombardment is not, in fact, towards ISIS at all, despite everything that they've said, and instead is targeting the small opposition forces that have been fighting against the Assad regime, and also that they've been targeting areas where there are civilians as well, which also causes huge problems and is increasing the number of refugees. So I think the first priority is what is the global response to that? What is the peace process response? And then, of course, the second most immediate response is what is the humanitarian aid that is needed, particularly in Turkey. We do need Turkey to open their borders to be able to help those refugees who are at the border now. But, of course, Turkey's already taken 2.5 million refugees within the country at the moment. And so the more support that they need, the better.
So do you think, then, that the EU should take even more, and within the EU that Britain should be doing more?
I do think that Britain needs to do more, yes, but it does have to be part of this global effort. So what I think the government did last week with the aid conference was a really important, and I've often criticised the government as part of this. On that one, I think they have done the right thing by putting the aid into the region and also getting other countries to put aid in as well, because the priority has to be for most people want to stay close to home, near to Syria, so they can return. But of course, we've also got people who have fled further, and when the rations in the camps were cut last year, in the refugee camps, that's what drove a lot of people into Europe as well. So look, Europe is going to have to cope with more people arriving in the course of this year. We've already seen an increase this year compared to last year, but it's going to have to be spread across the continent.
Well, across the continent and members of the European Union, and senior members of the European Union at this point anyway. The United Kingdom, we've got that number of 20,000 over 5 years, perhaps some more, several thousand more unaccompanied minors. But just on absolute numbers, do you think that should be enlarged?
Yes, Britain is going to have to do more.
What, though?
Well, I originally said, Britain should take 10,000 straight away, and that would mean helping if every city, every county across the country simply supported 10 refugee families. That in itself makes 10,000 people, and you could do that straight away within a year. I've also said I think it's right for us to help the unaccompanied child refugees, because we did that with the kinder transport, and we know that Europol have said 10,000 child refugees have just disappeared in Europe, probably into the arms of smuggler gangs, of traffickers, and even child prostitution and abuse. So I do think Britain can do more, but actually I think the best way to do that would be for us to just go around the country and ask communities how many people they could support.
And do you think they would respond positively? Because, judging by the recent polls, attitudes are rather hardening against even the numbers we are scheduled to take.
And I think you're right, people have become more worried. And I think part of the reason people have become more concerned is because they don't see where's the plan. Where is the comprehensive plan across Europe? I think we're still getting a huge amount of support. And if you ask communities themselves, rather than just tell people what to do, but ask towns, cities to come forward and say what they can do to help, you get a huge response. You get church groups, mosques, faith groups coming forward wanting to help, community organisations and so on. But my argument's always been this has got to be done with a plan that involves both sanctuary and border controls and checks. You've got to have proper systems in place to make sure there's security checks being done, but also to manage things, to have proper checks at borders, not just at Calais, not just in Greece, but right through Europe as well.
And I mean, people are conflating this. It's getting caught up, as we all know, with discussions about migration and immigration. Should these refugees, these asylum seekers, should they be allowed to work? Should they be allowed to establish themselves in the United Kingdom? Or when the time is right, and hopefully sooner rather than later, they go back to their country of origin?
Well, in a lot of places, what you're talking about is temporary sanctuary. So, for example, in the Bosnian crisis, a lot of people who we gave sanctuary to during that crisis ended up also returning to Bosnia afterwards and being able to be part of rebuilding their country. So we know a lot of people from Syria want to be able to return, and you're only talking about temporary sanctuary. And so I think you've also got to remember, refugees is different from asylum. Immigration and asylum are different things, and often we end up conflating the two. Part of the reason you need robust checks to find out, are people refugees, or do they have safe homes that they need to return to, and the immigration rules need to be enforced? You've got to be able to separate the two.
But it would help in terms of the contribution they can make to the society they return to, which is, by its very nature, going to have to be rebuilt, if they got skills, acquired skills here, through work, through education.
Sure, and once people have been designated as refugees, once they've been through, had the proper checks, then actually refugees can work. So that's all part of the existing rules. And we know, I've talked to Syrian doctors, teachers, lawyers, car mechanics, business owners, people who've all kinds of trades and skills. But I think, again, people will support that if they know that the proper rules are in place. So it's why I've argued within Europe we should also not have the Schengen system of no border checks within Europe as well. If you had proper checks within Europe alongside countries offering sanctuary, you can have both stability and humanity side by side.
How much do you think this is going to be an issue in the EU referendum? I mean, we're looking at the moment at as soon as June. Do you think this is going to be the single main issue?
I don't think it's going to be the single main issue, but I think
overseas.
it will be a part of the debate, and I think we've got to be discussing it as part of the debate because it's such an important issue. But I think what it shows, actually, when you're dealing with something that's such a big global problem, you need countries to work together. I think we would find it much harder to deal with the refugee crisis if we were out of Europe. We would find it harder to maintain our border checks in Calais rather than in Dover. That would cause big challenges for managing what happens. We would also find it harder to get other countries, whether it be Greece, whether it be Germany, whether it be other countries across Europe, to also be working together, both to put pressure on the Syrian process, but also to be able to have border checks, to have robust checks in place, and to give sanctuary to countries as well.
I mean, people listening to that will hear, your sophisticated analysis of the careful checks when it comes to dealing with migration, the definition of refugees, of asylum, but then they will look at the pronouncements of the current leadership and the likes of the Shadow Chancellor, who seems to be getting towards an open doors policy. Latest pronouncements on no illegal immigration. There are no illegal immigrants in the United Kingdom. Do you think that's been reflected, your view is being reflected in the current message from the Labour leadership?
Well, I don't think you can have open borders, and I don't think we're heading towards them either, because I think we have got more people travelling than ever before, but in response to that, you need to be able to manage that. You need to have a managed, ordered system, and that's why you need border controls, why you need border checks, and I think they're going to become more important in future. And they're more important, for example, in stopping smuggler gangs, in stopping child exploitation. Those 10,000 kids that Europol say have disappeared, how can you even find out which country they are in if you don't have the border checks in place to stop those gangs trafficking kids across borders?
Sounds like it could do with your voice in the Shadow Cabinet. I mean, I know you said after the leadership campaign it was personal and political reasons, wasn't it, that you said you didn't want to serve in the Shadow Cabinet. Are any of those changing for you?
Well, to be honest, this is such an important issue that I'm concentrating on working on the refugee crisis and what not just Britain's response should be, but also Britain and Europe's response. And we're promoting an amendment in the House of Lords in the next few weeks, which is about taking 3,000 child refugees, just as we did with the kinder transport. And Alf Dubs, who was himself came here under the kinder transport and was rescued from the Holocaust, is the law that I've been working with and proposing that. So that's what I'm concentrating on.
But, I mean, it's just that voice in the shadow cabinet, so therefore reflected at senior levels, because you're aware of the reports that there have been into why Labour lost last May, and one of the reasons coming back at you, and we talked about it before, didn't we, while you were in the leadership campaign, was not taking the issue of migration seriously or being perceived to be in that position. Well, there you are, as we've discussed here, with a very thought out position, but it's not coming from the top anymore.
Well, I think Andy Burnham is actually now going around the country wanting to talk to people about wider issues, about immigration. And as I've said, I think immigration and asylum, you've got to keep them separate. But the issue about immigration is a really important one for Britain. And we do have to recognise the concerns that there are and also the reforms that are needed. But I think that's exactly what Andy's doing. OK,
but if Mr Corbyn hits the buffers in May, we've got this series of electoral tests coming up. I mean, have you written off a future front bench or even leadership career for good?
I think right now I'm concentrating on this. I think that's the right thing for me to do. But look, all of us across the party need to be working hard on the local elections, the London mayoral election as well. And I'm sure that, Jeremy and all the leadership of the party will be focused on what it is we need to do in order to win those elections. Because, that's in the end is what the Labour Party's for, is to be able to win elections and to get power in order to be able to change the country for the people that we need to stand up for.
And just after that, as we discussed, you might be facing an EU referendum. How hard and how visibly are you going to be campaigning for a Remain vote, and who with?
I'll be strongly campaigning for us to stay in Europe. We have to. I think whether you're talking about stability of Europe, whether you're talking about dealing with what is the Syrian refugee crisis, whether you're talking about jobs. My constituency, I've talked to the people who run the factories in my constituency who say how important it is for them to be able to trade. But the who with bit of it,
so, Chukwuemeka, your colleague, says, well, I'll be happy to, this is too important to have party political lines. I'll be on a platform with anyone.
Yeah, and I think we'll all be campaigning, and I'll be campaigning. I mean, we've got Alan Johnson is leading the Labour In campaign.
Labour.
But
Any Conservatives?
And we'll also obviously be working with the Stronger In campaign as well. Of course, you've got to. And I think probably what you've seen this sort of bickering and division on the Out campaign, and I think that actually reveals something deeper, which is that in the end they don't know what they're campaigning for. We know what we're campaigning for, which is we want reforms in Europe. We've got to have changes in Europe, but we also know we've got to be part of that European partnership at a time when there's so many global threats. They're divided because they actually haven't a clue. There's some of them who want to be Norway, and that means just effectively being outside, having no say, but still paying in, still having to abide by Europe's rules and having no say. There's others who just want to build a wall around Britain and think we can hide ourselves in a bunker and have nothing to do with the outside world. That, in the end, is why they're fighting.
Yvette Cooper, great seeing you. Thank you very much indeed.